This is the kind of thing Rhode Island is known for. The Marble House, former home of William Vanderbilt. At one time, summer cottages like this one dotted the Newport shoreline. Newport was the playland of the rich, and the history is all here to prove it. But more than a decade before this was built, there was another, different kind of playground. Unlike the mansions, there was not much left of this playground. We're still in Rhode Island, only a dozen or so miles north of Newport, in the city of East Providence. Once upon a time, this was the place to play. It wasn't designed for the rich, but for the everyman. On weekends, 50 to 75,000 people would come to this very spot. 10,000 people could be fed at any one time. It was nicknamed the Coney Island of the East. And this is how it all started. The year is 1860. The town of East Providence, Rhode Island is still 2 years away from official incorporation. The southern part of East Providence is called Wannamoyset, the Indian term for good fishing place. The few residents here make their living from the waters of Narragansett Bay. Industrialization in Rhode Island is changing the way people work, and also how they play. Textile manufacturing is thriving to the north in Pawtucket, and select groups of people are discovering what it means to have a little extra money lying around. The new rich need a place to get away from it all, and they set sights on Wannamoyset, which is quickly adopting its new name of Riverside. In 1860, this section of land overlooking the bay becomes the site of one of Riverside's first hotels. It's called Vue de l'Eau, or Water View. The Vue de l'Eau, with its broad lawn and bay view, is quickly becoming the place to go to unwind after a long year at the mills. What may seem a simple vacation spot to us in the late 20th century was a paradise to people just 100 years ago. Brown University's Don Wilmuth explains how a change of scenery made great vacation spots in the mid-1800s.
For the average Joe, there were pleasure gardens, which the pleasure garden is really a precursor of the amusement park. But it was very simple. It was a large acreage with walkways, musical entertainment, some variety entertainment, band shells, bowling greens, very simple. Those became rather boring to the people. That's why they began to add amusement rides, for example, because it was more exciting, it was more fun.
The person who would eventually put the excitement into East Providence's pleasure garden was born in St. Petersburg, Virginia. At the age of 31, George B. Boyden took over as the Vue de l'Eau's first caterer. Meanwhile, things were happening directly across the lawn of the hotel to the south. A group of cotton industrialists were using nearby Whortleberry Island as a spot for an annual clambake outing. In 1871, the men founded the Squantum Association and built a series of kitchens and clubhouses that stretched to the lawn of the Vue de l'Eau. 3 years later, Boyden, always the entrepreneur, decided to try the bakery business, and with a loan of $500, rented a few rooms in the center of town. Boyden worked in his bakery and also as head caterer at Squantum, serving countless clam bakes to its exclusive membership. In 1886, Boyden borrowed more money and signed a 5-year lease with John Davis to rent the land east of the What Cheer House, a large 40-room hotel nestled on the land of Thomas B. Page, a few miles south of Squantum. It was on this land that Boyden started a new kind of business. With assets rumored at just $65, he put up bathhouses on the beach and took the name for his new enterprise from the shape of the shoreline itself. Sometime in 1886, Boyden started publicizing his new shore resort as Crescent Park. The idea of a shore resort was nothing new to Riverside. Since 1869, Ocean Cottage and Silver Spring were doing a fine business near Squantum, and Camp White was thriving just down the street from What Cheer. The typical shore resort at the time consisted of a handful of small cottages or tent platforms which were rented out. A music dance hall was the usual source of entertainment, and food was available at the Shore Dinner Hall. Even as far back as the 1860s, the Rhode Island Shore Dinner had become famous all over New England. Consisting of a menu of lobster, clams, and fish, the Shore Dinner probably did more to bring people to Riverside than the shore itself. The land Boyden rented was the upper part of Bullock's Point, part of a large farm controlled by 3 descendants of Richard Bullock, the original owner. Boyden wanted more land for his newfound resort, and in late November of 1889, he leased the entire point, some 300 acres, for just under $3,500 a year. With all that land, Boyden began subletting small plots at $37.50 a year for summer houses. Part of Boyden's new property consisted of the Bullock's Point Pier, a 400-foot dock jutting out of the shoreline into Narragansett Bay. The pier was an ideal spot for bay steamers to load and unload visitors to the beach at Crescent Park. The other ideal method of transportation was the trolley car that made a loop directly in front of the What Cheer House.
The trolley companies were looking for ways to get people out of the city on the weekends. A relatively inexpensive form of amusement that would force them to take the trolley. So the early amusement parks, of course, were called trolley parks, not amusement parks.
The people who really helped to put money into the parks to get them started would have been the United Transit, or the United Street Railways Company. That was the title, I think, in those days. And they would have them built on the end of the line. In other words, you would have to ride 2 fares to get to the end and 2 fares back again at the end of the day.
One person not enchanted by Boyden's resort was a Mr. Woodward, manager of the What Cheer House, who had changed the name of the rooming house to the Bullock's Point Hotel. Legend has it that Woodward was having problems keeping guests because of the noise from the beaches at Crescent Park. Sometime before 1890, Woodward gave up as manager, and Boyden took over the hotel, which he renamed the Crescent Park Hotel. With control of the rooming house and all the land south of it, Crescent Park was taking full shape. Boyden had always made his money in food service. Unfortunately, he was having trouble getting people off the beach and up to his soda and ice cream stands near the hotel. Boyden knew he needed an attraction, something special to get people off the beach. He found one in, of all places, Brooklyn, New York. Charles I.D. Loof was a woodcarver from Schleswig-Holstein, Denmark. In August 1870, at the age of 18, he emigrated to Brooklyn and set up a small furniture business. In his spare time, he carved wooden animals in his basement. Within 5 years, Loof had created his first merry-go-round and set it up in Coney Island. In 1892, Loof signed this deed with George Boyden. Loof would lease a small tract of land by the wharf. There, he would
erect on said lot a pavilion 90 feet in diameter and a machine inside of the same about 50 feet in diameter, with 3 figures abreast in chariots seating comfortably not less than 70 persons. Said machine to be A number 1, with all the latest improvements and one of the best ever put up.
And we all know what that was. This is not the merry-go-round that the deed spoke of. This is the second carousel that Loof built at Crescent Park 3 years later. The first was built on the side of the wharf. It was also not the first merry-go-round in the area. John Walker already had a small carousel near the hotel. However, it paled before the two machines that Loof constructed. When it comes to carousels, not many people know more about their construction than William Finkenstein. William and his company, R&F Designs, restore historical merry-go-rounds and operate the New England Carousel Museum.
If you look at the rounding boards on the Crescent Park ride, and you look up on top, there's a face on each rounding board. And the face has a different look to it. And apparently, the story goes that Loof had sat in front of a mirror or just did some sketches of himself doing all these different little faces, and then he put them up there.
The carousel became the anchor Boyden's resort needed. He began advertising Crescent Park as the Coney Island of the East, and by 1898, the resort was living up to every bit of its name.
There are carousels that have great horses, but the mechanisms are you know, and then you have great mechanisms and the horses are so-so. And then you have great horses and great mechanisms, but the band organs aren't as nice. Crescent Park has all the elements to be a great carousel to see, because the structure that it's in is beautiful, and the architecture is a great piece of art. And then you go to the inside, and the mechanics, the mechanism, the rounding boards, all those items are beautiful. The band organ, exquisite. And then you see the horses that are top line, so that where other carousels fall short, they have a little bit of the best of everything.
Boyden had expanded. He now had dining room facilities for 10,000 people. The park comprised over 300 acres, most of it used for growing the food that Boyden used to feed his guests. Millions of people passed through the resort every season, sometimes as many as 50 to 75,000 people on one day. The guests poured off boats, which landed at the pier every half hour, and arrived by trolley every 6 minutes.
And years ago, I can remember outings coming in by train, pulling in at the other side of the cove over here, and thousands of them getting off the train, crossing the little drawbridge that the hurricane of '38 wiped out, and coming into the park and going up to the shore dinner hall and having their meal, and then taking part of all the rides that the park had.
While Boyden was a pioneer in Rhode Island, he was not an inventor. He was simply cashing in on the new popular entertainment of his day.
The World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 was the first time that showmen realized the potential of amusement parks and fairs and carnivals, for that matter. The traveling carnival and the Midway really came out of the World's Fair in Chicago. And also right across the street from the Columbian Exposition, Buffalo Bill set up his Wild West show. They wouldn't give him any area on the grounds of the fair. That became as popular as the fairground itself. In fact, that was the big change. Much to the chagrin of the entrepreneurs of the fair, the Midway was as popular as the more cultural, educational parts of the fair.
Boyden became a master showman, importing Wild West shows as well as bands from all over the country. In 1896, Boyden had one of the first bicycle racing tracks in America installed at the park. Whatever the public wanted, Boyden provided. In 10 years, he had grown from failed baker to king of the largest summer resort in the world operated by just one man. And that's where a problem developed. Boyden only leased the land the park was built on. He owned nothing but 2 or 3 of the wood frame buildings that dotted the park. The rides were owned by people like Loof and the Boston Shoe Company. Even the soda machines and counters were rented. For all the park's size and grandeur, Boyden owned practically nothing of it. The descendants of Bullock still own the land. As they passed it down from family member to family member, Bullock's Point was getting divided up into smaller and smaller shares. No one family member owned a specific part, simply a small share of the whole. The Hope Land Company was incorporated in 1896. Its sole purpose was to buy Bullock's Point, have it platted, and then deed back appropriate shares to the family members. Boyden was to be frozen out. For several years, Hopeland negotiated with the Point's owners. Property and leases were renegotiated, and in October of 1901, Boyden sold his leases to Crescent Park for $30,000. And Hope Land Company, under the direction of William Dexter, took over the entire resort. George Boyden made every effort to bounce back. In December 1901, he leased the area in back of the Squantum Club. It was the same land which had once been the home of Vue de l'Eau. He bought the land for $30,000 and opened a resort called Boyden Heights. The resort never caught the public's imagination, and on December 3, 1902, at the age of 62, George B. Boyden declared bankruptcy. Probably one of the greatest showmen in Rhode Island history, vanished into time. Crescent Park lived on. Fred Dexter, the vice president of the Hope Land Company, had the lower part of Bullock's Point platted and zoned for residential housing. Crescent Park remained active on its original 50-acre site at the north end of the point. On January 9th of 1902, Dexter announced the construction of a large exhibition hall at the park. The building would be 326 feet long, 122 feet wide, and 49 feet high. It would contain over 40,000 square feet of floor space and be built as an exposition hall for the forthcoming meeting of the New England Association of Arts and Crafts. It was to be a grand building, and one of the last great efforts to keep up the image of elegance Boyden had started a decade ago. The building would feature over 3,000 light bulbs.
They mentioned the number of electric light bulbs, for example, in the 1880s and 90s when they first started using electricity. 100,000 light bulbs or whatever. That gave it, I mean, people weren't used to seeing light bulbs outdoors.
Ground for the hall was broken on April 16, 1902, and the building was completed by June 1st. For the first decade of 1900, the park continued to thrive. Loof built the first roller coaster, called a Flying Toboggan Ride, and a Tunnel of Love, called the Rivers of Venice. He also built the Miss Loof, a 160-foot riverboat that, due to construction and design flaws, failed to pass its first sea test, and therefore remained tied up at the end of the pier. The resort also was home to a music hall, several short dinner halls, a bowling alley, and pony stable. Over 1,800,000 people continued to flock each season to the sandy beaches, the clam bakes, and the rides. On July 26, 1906, Fred Dexter died at age 48 from Bright's disease. In his estate, he left several shares of Hope Land Company stock to Charles Loof. The Hope Land Company quickly turned over management duties to Colonel R.A. Harrington, owner of Rocky Point, another shore resort in Warwick, Rhode Island, across the bay and to the south of Crescent Park. A year earlier, Loof had moved his carousel business from Brooklyn to Riverside and made East Providence his summer factory. It was here that Loof built 5 carousels in his first year.
It enabled him to take people through and say, gee, you could buy any one of these horses, maybe the most fancy on being on the outside and the less intricate on the inside. Would you like armored? Would you like more of a Western style? So he could actually show them through just as kind of like an automobile showroom and have them choose and pick off that ride.
In 1910, he and his youngest son Arthur left Rhode Island to set up another factory in Long Beach, California. The Riverside factory was left to son Charles Loof Jr. While the Loofs set themselves up to take over the park, something big was happening just to the north. Vanity Fair opened its gates on May 25, 1907. The resort covered 40 acres of Silver Spring and was all in all the most ambitious project of its day. Vanity Fair featured larger rides and even grander attractions than its southerly neighbor. To give you an idea of the scale of Vanity Fair, the main amusement was an attraction called Fighting the Flames. A special building was constructed in the park. Several times each day, a fire, courtesy of hidden gas jets, engulfed the building. Performers would dive from flaming windows as a full fire company extinguished the flames, all for the amusement of excited spectators. Vanity Fair became the closest thing to a theme park the country would see for another 40 years. Fortunately for Crescent Park, the thrill of Vanity Fair was short-lived. A year after its opening, the developers behind the resort ran out of money. In 1912, Vanity Fair burned to the ground. With its main competition gone, Charles Loof wanted badly to own all of Crescent Park. In 1914, Loof built the new Shore Dinner Hall. Despite their emotional and physical investment in the park, the Loofs just leased small sections of it. Around 1919, Charles Loof negotiated a private contract with Hope Land, giving him first rights to purchase the park. Two other parties were interested in the park, or rather the land it rested on. Standard Oil of New York had in 1915 purchased the former grounds of Vanity Fair, and now looked at Crescent Park as the next good location to build a refinery. While many residents resisted the idea of losing their resort, the East Providence Town Council loved it. East Providence was charging a tax on each gallon of fuel stored in the town. More oil meant more dollars. The other party interested in the park was the Beacon Manufacturing Company of Fall River. Beacon made blankets and for years ran a small stand on the midway at the park. Beacon owned this land just north of Crescent Park and wanted to build a plant here. The last thing Beacon wanted was a factory built next to an oil refinery. In 1919, a series of negotiations took place between Loof, Hope Land, and Beacon Blanket. Beacon was unsure of Loof's ability to run the park, but worried that Standard Oil might still move in. A complex real estate deal was concocted. Using a series of middlemen, Hope sold the park to Loof for $175,000. The lower part of Bullock's Point was sold to John Carpenter, another developer, while the upper part went to Beacon Blanket. Loof borrowed $10,000 for a down payment and mortgaged the rest to representatives of Beacon. All this was designed so that if Loof went bankrupt, Beacon would get the land by default. Almost all of the transactions never mentioned Beacon Manufacturing, successfully covering up their freeze-out of Standard Oil. What none of the parties realized was that there was another major force well on its way to affecting the future of the park. More than any individual or business, pollution was quickly doing in one of the park's most popular attractions. Trudy Cox of Rhode Island Save the Bay explains.
Certainly, at the turn of the century, this Providence sewage treatment plant, for example, was not even constructed until the late 1890s. And up to that point, it was just plain old raw sewage coming from our streets. And Providence was quite a thriving town. It was a real city, so it was hundreds of thousands of people's waste ending up in the bay. I think that, interestingly, people have different views of pollutants. Sewage is probably, in terms of health, long-term impacts on health, not as bad as some of the toxics that were being discharged into the bay. But sewage is something that people just don't like for a lot of obvious reasons. We had a very thriving textile industry. We had a still thriving, to this day, jewelry manufacturing industry. The quantities of metals and chemicals coming out of both industries was really extraordinary, and it is still to this day.
The water was beautiful. I can remember as a young fellow here coming down from Pawtucket, my mother would go out and tell her, get some quahogs, get some clams to make a chowder or steamers or something. Just walk out with the bucket and pick all you want to. The water was beautiful. Now you couldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Too bad.
On September 1st, 1920, Loof took control of the park. For 5 years, it lived on. The exhibition hall underwent a series of changes. First, it became a roller skating rink, and later a dance hall. The name of the building was changed to the Alhambra. On January 11th, Charles Loof died at the age of 49. He had outlived his father by only 4 years. By his death, Loof defaulted on his mortgage. Once again, ownership of the resort was unsure, but the plans of Hope Land Company and Beacon Blanket slid smoothly into action. Through a series of auctions and lawsuits, Beacon took control of the park in November of 1926. By that time, the company had abandoned plans to build a factory nearby, opting instead to relocate its base of operations to Swinona, North Carolina. By moving out of New England, Beacon became the resort's first absentee landlord. They appointed John T. Clare as manager and moved south. Beacon and Clare ran the park for 3 decades. During that time, many of the traditions of the park were continued, including the annual celebration of Emancipation Day. As far as most can remember, Crescent Park was never segregated in any way, unlike many other resorts. Joseph Brown grew up on the east side of Providence, just up the bay from the park. He remembers how the park was chosen as the site for Emancipation Day.
Emancipation Day, or August 1st, was celebrated by all the Negroes in Rhode Island down at Crescent Park. And it was quite an affair. It was a celebration, you know, joy and everything of becoming freedom from slavery. They chose some high school youngster that had excelled and stuff to recite the preamble. And then another from another school maybe to recite the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, would grant it the abolition of slavery, abolishment, I should say, of slavery all over the United States. Now this was the prime purpose of that, to come, your shackles off, come down, enjoy yourself, meet people. And even though people moved from Rhode Island, when August 1st came, they came from as far as Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and brought their families. And it was a great event. People sitting up there meeting old friends, see who was still around and who was, you know, where's so-and-so. And that's why Grandma Twine used to sit right up near the clam chowder place, was a seat right where the buses let the people off, so she could see everybody. And everyone would come down, oh, Grandma Twine is still here. She was well known, see. And she wanted everybody to see her and to see everybody.
In the early 1930s, Dominic Spinola came to the park. Working for Park Beach and Supply Company of New York, he was responsible for building many of the rides at Crescent Park.
Then they had the main rides were the Tumblebug. They had the coaster was really the main ride then. And then they started to have more of these rides that you can walk through. And there were the horror things and the allure for that. And they didn't have the black light, they didn't have the thing, but I started to get this man who started to make this, the color, the paint that was on the first alarm clocks at night, so that you wake up in the night and you saw the letters shining in the light. And with that, and the beginning of the fluorescent paint a little bit. With that, I painted, had the light in a room would activate the light, and I had, just like you would have in Rome, one of those burial places, you know, rows of figures of skeletons and other stuff in there. And you'd have these figures, and this would be activated with the light. When the people came through the door, the light went off, and this was glowing, and you'd see these skeletons and these figures over here. Some of the things, we couldn't get them to move, with no time, but there were some things I hooked up with the door, and the weight come down there and move, just make a little bit of movement.
In 1935, the Crescent Park Hotel, formerly the What Cheer House, was torn down. The hotel had served countless guests for almost 75 years. The land it rested on was to be used for additional parking. Crescent Park was changing in other ways as well. World War II had broken out, and while the rest of the country struggled with the war effort, the park began to slip.
It started because it got boring. I mean, one can only be entertained for so long walking around a pleasant environment, or going to a dance hall and you know, hearing a stately band.
It was a great push for the car. When they had the car, they all came to the park. They didn't have to crowd in on the trolley cars. But just that same way, they could all go out different places with the car. And so many more places on the road are attracting the cars. When you can get around with the car, no one can have any control of the public. So the local man doesn't have his customers go elsewhere because they can move.
The amusement park really starts declining during World War II. They didn't have sugar, no cotton candy. They couldn't get steel, rubber, a lot of things that make amusement parks go just weren't available.
In 1941, attendance at the park had dropped to 15,000 visitors on a good weekend. People were still enjoying the park, but the slow decline of the Coney Island of New England had started. Another factor weighing heavily on the park was the fact that the water, the very thing that drew millions to the park every season, was becoming unswimmable.
If you look at the urban waterfront, which I include East Providence and Providence as being similar, at some point in history, I'm not sure when, a transition was made, and it must have happened very quickly, between its being a recreational and a people-oriented waterfront center to being a place where you could put your oil tanks and a place where you could put your industrial uses and a place where people stay away.
So by the 50s, most of the major amusement parks were really in desperate need of renovation, but no one really could afford them. And that's about the same times, remember, Disneyland in Anaheim started in the mid-50s. So the theme park picks up about the time that the amusement park is on its decline.
David Cassioli knows a lot about the difference between theme parks and amusement parks. For 15 years, he has managed Rocky Point, Crescent Park's 140-year-old sister resort, still operating in Warwick, Rhode Island.
The large corporate parks like Six Flags and Disney World, King's Dominion, places of that nature are planned parks. Some developer goes in, takes a fixed piece of land and actually makes out a master plan for a park, and it's actually opened and perceived as the place that it is when it opens. That's the original perception of the park. So you've got two basically different types of theories working there. You've got a family type amusement park like Rocky Point that started off as a much smaller entity and generated over the years into what it is. And then you've got the planned facility, which the day it opened its doors, it started off as what it currently is.
On March 28, 1951, Crescent Park changed hands again. The Crescent Park Realty Company purchased the park for $300,000. The president of the company was Arthur R. Simmons, Charles I.D. Loof's grandson. His partner was Fred McCusker, whose family had operated the soda and popcorn stand at the park for 50 years. Crescent Park was once again a family business. Ed Sarowick joined the maintenance staff that worked to rejuvenate the aging resort.
When we came here, the park was pretty run down, and the buildings were pretty shabby, you know, and Arthur Simmons bought the park along with Fred McCusker, and they decided that they wanted to rebuild the park and make it look nice, you know, make a family-oriented park. We did a lot of the fronts of the buildings over. We tried to upgrade the rides. The rides were pretty run down, so we had to do a lot of maintenance work on them, you know, to get what was here in shape. And then as he went along, he decided to put in a few new rides, you know, and we took out, like the pony track, we took that out because at the time the ponies were getting to be more of a nuisance than they were an attraction. We put the riverboat ride in, and we put in a scrambler, brand new scrambler. We put in Westwood Ho, and Dominic was here. He made a lot of figures for the Westwood Ho. That was the automobile ride that ran down where the old Tumblebug used to be.
In many ways, it was the ideal job for a kid who had grown up around the park.
We would get in the car or the roller coaster and go for a ride and jump out halfway around, and we'd walk along the track, you know, and people would be wondering what we were doing, you know. But if you knew how to do it, it was, you know, it wasn't dangerous.
East Providence Fire Chief Anthony Guglielmo was sworn onto the force in 1955. As in many instances, Crescent Park acted as the backdrop.
It was a kind of a proud night for all of us that were being sworn. We had completed the schooling that the department ran. They had brought in speakers, and there was officials there at the Shore Dinner Hall. And when we left the Shore Dinner Hall after the affair was over, as I said before, we were invited to go into the ballroom, and Guy Lombardo was playing there. And the park was just busting with people. The dance hall was full of people because he was very popular. And it was just an exciting night all around. It really, really was.
Despite the new ownership, the park was showing signs of age. The roller coaster, built in the 1930s, had been battered by 2 major hurricanes. In December of 1961, it was finally dismantled, and its wooden framework scavenged for other rides.
All the lumber from the riverboat came from the roller coaster. If we needed 2x4s or 2x6s, we'd run over to the roller coaster and saw off what we needed for the day, and we'd come back and build a riverboat ride from it.
The 400-foot pier was left to rot.
We can remember sitting and looking out the office window there in 51 and 54, because I was involved in those days, and watching the dock, which we had repaired after the 38 hurricane, and went again. And so no more dock. They just couldn't lay their money out on that.
During the early 60s, the park got a $100,000 facelift.
He tried to make it back to a family-oriented park by rebuilding the kiddie land and putting in some of the rides that maybe everybody could go on.
Despite the age of some of the rides, the park had been relatively accident-free. But on September 2nd, 1962, the first major accident at the park occurred.
I was right here. In fact, I was standing right outside the satellite ride. It was pretty busy. It was a weekend, and the ride had started, and it was about 3/4 full of people, and it went up okay. And when it got about halfway down, the main shaft that the ride rocked on busted, and it came down, and it must have fell about 10 feet. And it didn't stop right away. It made a couple of revolutions, and when it did that, it pulled all the hydraulic lines apart, and there was hot oil shooting around the midway, and the cage went down off the side of the truck and hit the midway and came back up. And there were some people that got pretty well banged up.
Although several children were hospitalized, the most serious injury was a broken leg. As the rest of the country experienced Woodstock, the Beatles, and Vietnam, Crescent Park just plodded along. The strong friendship between Simmons and McCusker began to deteriorate, and with it, so did Arthur's interest in running the park. At the close of the 1966 season, Crescent Park got its 6th owner. Melvin T. Berry was a showman in the spirit of George Boyden. He came to the park with great promises of changing and upgrading the park to almost Disney-like stature. Berry had purchased 2 large pavilions from the New York World's Fair. He announced that he would install both at Crescent Park, using over $1.5 million to modernize the whole facility.
Try to make it a theme park, and he brought a lot of stuff in from the World's Fair. And he just didn't finish whatever he started. They changed the ballroom over to rock concerts, you know, and it just wasn't working out because this was a family park.
It had been exactly 7 years since the crash of the satellite ride, when on September 2nd, 1969, Crescent Park suffered its 2nd major tragedy.
The alarm came in, and the apparatus from this station and Station 2 responded to the fire at the Alhambra Ballroom. The fire had exposed itself in the rear of the building and coming out of the front door of the lounge, which would be the back of the building. The building was an old wooden structure, and the fire just went right through the entire structure rapidly, and there was really very little chance of saving it.
Well, someone called me at home. I didn't know that the fire had started, and somebody called me at home to look out my window to look at the sky, and it was completely red. So I came down, and the rear of the ballroom had already been going pretty good, right where the Colonnade Lounge was. That's where they figured it started, in one of the coolers, you know, that was in the basement of the Colonnade. And I sat out on the midway on one of the rides that was there, and I could look right inside the door of the Alhambra Ballroom, and I could see the fire coming up the floor, and it was rolling, and I could watch each chandelier as the fire got closer to the front of the building. Each chandelier would fall, and it would come in, each one, until it got to the very front of the building, and then the whole thing went in.
The fire was rolling, that's what it was doing. The combustible parts of the building there were just superheated to the ignition temperature, and just as soon as the oxygen was introduced, it just flashed over and traveled at a tremendous pace. When the word spread that it burned, the people were coming in from all over the area there and reminiscing about, you know, everybody had a soft spot in their heart because they could associate part of their life or something that happened in their life with the Alhambra Ballroom.
To make up for the lost ballroom, Barry switched his focus to thrill rides like the Turbo to bring people into the park. The Turbo, with its upside-down cars and breakneck speed, was a far cry from the relatively safe feeling one got on the carousel. Yet it seemed to be what the people wanted. Despite the new thrill rides, Barry's promises of turning the park into a New England Disneyland never materialized.
I could see the way the park business was going. We wasn't getting the crowds. They put an admission on the gate, and the business just wasn't like it used to be, and it wasn't run the same way either. And like if we went out to get something maintenance-wise for the park, everything started to be COD. You know, so I just had to leave it. I couldn't take it anymore.
They changed the policy all around, and I didn't like the way it was going, so I get out. I had another offer of a job.
Crescent Park was turning into a money pit. On April 22nd, 1969, Barry put the park up for sale. Fairbanks Industries formed the Crescent Park Recreation Corporation to purchase the park for $350,000. Fred Perry was put in charge of managing the park. Although Fairbanks owned and operated a number of entertainment ventures in New England, it became clear in 1970 that amusements were not necessarily the only option for the park. Fairbanks was looking at rezoning the area and looking to build apartments on the 50-plus acre lot. It seemed that the very spirit of the park and the people who ran it was dying as fast as the park itself.
It's hard for them to run a park when everybody wants to be dressed like everybody else. The carpenter looks at the salesman that comes in. He's working in the park up on there, and he looks at the salesman, and he resents that because he's like the peasant that saw the Lord come on a horse up high, you see. Now, if he's not interested in his work that there much to be affected by this person coming in dressed up in his work, that's his uniform. This is my uniform. And I don't give a rap who likes it or doesn't like it, you see.
While the company waited on the City Council's decision on rezoning, the money to operate Crescent Park ran out. The Crescent Park Recreation Corporation filed for bankruptcy, declaring over $1.4 million of debt. The mortgage holder, Hartford National Bank, put the lot and all the rides on the auction block. When the auction was held on March 18, 1976, most participants felt slighted. They had been given only a few minutes to look over the property and were suddenly asked to bid on items they had hardly seen. The bidding took a matter of minutes. Owen B. Landman, attorney for the newly formed Crescent Park Amusement Company, purchased 56 acres of waterfront land and all the rides, including the Louvre Carousel, for just $490,000. The firm turned over the operational duties to Gilbane Properties Incorporated.
I think with Crescent Park you've got a combination of things. I think you've got one, the failure to stay current with what the market expects. And I think it's also a simple matter of dollars and cents. I think that some investors saw an opportunity to cash in on their investment because that's when we're going through the high end of the real estate boom, where everything was going to condominiums, where there were large prices offered for certain tracts of land that were in good locations. So I think you've got a combination of both of them.
Despite the good price, the new company couldn't generate enough money to keep the park going either. In 1979, the city of East Providence stepped in and bought the park for $500,000. The city had no interest in operating a shore resort. So in the spring of 1979, the gates at Crescent Park stayed closed. For For the first time in 94 years, summer passed over a lifeless park. When Crescent Park first opened on the shores of Narragansett Bay, Grover Cleveland was president. Coca-Cola was still 2 years away. Motion pictures were still in the experimental stage, and TV, an unheard-of dream. The park lasted through 4 wars and 18 presidents. By 1980, the Coney Island of the East lay in ruins, and the memories of countless people who had walked the Midway at Crescent Park were blown back into the past.
Yes, I think that something's lost. I bring my grandson down there to ride the carousel, but there's something missing. I know it's gone, but the people who haven't experienced don't realize what they're missing. The roller coaster and the rides, Dodgems, and there are a lot of the cotton candy, and there's something that's really missing in your life. It's like losing a family member.
In the last half dozen years, most of the major amusement parks in New England have closed down. And that's true everywhere. I think it's a thing of the past. Theme parks, on the other hand, are doing bonanza business.
As East Providence searched for a proposal to develop the land, public outcry over the fate of the Louvre Carousel became the talk of the city.
When the city decided that they finally owned or had the agreement to buy this land, it was advertised. The land was advertised in national publications for the purposes of soliciting development, and public hearings were held. And at those hearings, I think the residents who attended expressed they didn't want extensive housing. They didn't want, most of them wanted the park kept, which was not financially feasible for the city. And all of them expressed they wanted a carousel saved. So after those hearings were held, and the city had input from all the residents, as I said, they advertised. And I believe they received 12 development proposals. Of the 12, the city council decided 3 would be shown to the public, which was a violation of our city charter. We formed the organization known as Save Our Carousel, and we did that because at this point all of our trust had begun to erode between the residents and the city council. And we felt that the main purpose of everybody getting involved was for this carousel, and we could slowly see that it was a white elephant in the face of development. When you saw us on television, it looked like we were hundreds in numbers. There were actually about 5 or 6 of us. We just had loud voices. And we did what we had to do to get the job done. We just kept fighting, and they didn't quite know what to do with us. We would intimidate them on every issue in the city. I mean, it wasn't just the carousel anymore. I don't care if it was a fish and fowl ordinance. I would address it and look them right in the eye. And then as election time grew near, I organized at least 3 campaigns, because 3 is the name of the game of a 5-member city council. We put our own people in. And we just did what we had to do. It became the courts, the election process. It was a full-time job. In fact, I gave up a full-time job just to see it through. We were a low-budget show, We had a consent judgment handed down that spelled out the terms of what could and could not be done as far as the developer went, what he could and could not build on this land. 11.7 acres was set aside for public use. The carousel would remain here in perpetuity. And the land that we had, or the people gained out of all this, the 11 acres, would be used for passive recreation only. And we all signed off in July of 1982.
We almost lost them all. Thinking of 2,000 to 3,000 at the turn of the century and less than 200 today, I hear stories weekly from people that say they knew about this carousel or that carousel, that the park broke up and they threw them on the scrap heap.
We all rode the merry-go-round. We all rode the carousel. It was the one ride that anyone that ever went to a carnival of any sort, a fair, an amusement park, you rode when you were very small.
With the safety of the merry-go-round secure, the park was torn apart, and a series of housing units were built on the site of the former Playground of New England. The Carousel Park Commission was formed by city ordinance to restore the Louvre masterpiece. On July 28, 1984, the Louvre Carousel reopened to the public. In 7 weekends, 73,000 people rode the flying horses.
You can make believe it's anything you want it to be. I mean, you're a charger. Your imagination can run wild, both adult and child, and I think it happens. And if you take the time to look at the faces of the riders, you'll see where I'm coming from.
I do see the faces coming in every day. And when I see them come through that front door, there's something magic here. I don't have a handle on it, but you see their faces, and everybody seems to be going back to a brighter day, to a memory of their mother or father holding them on a carousel. That type of thing. It was the best of times. You know, it was a family day at a park. More feeling in here, I think.
If the carousel was to remain at the park, what were the chances of rebuilding the resort? Could the momentum of the city bring back Crescent Park?
No. No. There's too many big theme parks around now. Yeah, I think it's bad. I think it's bad because how many people, say just in the city of East Providence, can get away to get to a big theme park where they could just drive down the road a few miles and come to a park and have a good day? You know, they used to go to Lincoln Park, Rocky Point, Crescent Park. They can't do that anymore. They'd have to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to go to a park now.
I doubt it. Another thing, they're very expensive. And then now with that thing, you have to pay to go into the park before, you know, even before you go into something. It seems to be much more commercialized than it was at that time. It seemed like the parks were manned by people who understood how people would like to enjoy themselves, and they were there to enjoy the people enjoying themselves, see.
While the park may never come back, the very thing that attracted people to the area might.
I do not have any doubts about the fact that more of the bay could be opened up for both swimming and for shellfishing purposes. And in fact, we're already seeing some consequences of an improved Providence sewage treatment plant. In the last few years, 3,000 to 4,000 acres of the upper bay were opened up to shellfishing. And I know from personal experience that had anyone said in the late 1970s that the upper bay would be opened up to shellfishing within the next decade, everyone would have laughed. So technology really does work.
And yet, even though we may see the days of swimming in the upper bay return, chances are the days of the seaside amusement park are gone. This is, or rather was, Lincoln Park. It outlived Crescent Park by a decade. However, in 1988, it too saw its last season. Shortly, this too will all be gone. At the same time Lincoln Park closed, Disney was putting the finishing touch on its latest attraction, the Disney MGM Tour in Florida.
Certainly the theme parks are far more phenomenal in terms of rides, in terms of environments, in terms of technology at work. I probably don't find them as appealing because I remember the old amusement park very clearly. There's so many things we can do now to amuse ourselves. You know, I mean, we stay home and amuse ourselves a lot, you know, with cable and with video and so forth.
Rocky Point has these fabulous rides, a lot of money.
David Cassioli states that it is simply good management that makes expensive thrill rides possible. While many people may not like the very unsentimental approach to running parks, David sees it as a necessity.
I do not consider us the last of a breed because the breed has changed. In other words, we can't look at ourselves and say we're the last of a breed of particular type of operators because it's no longer the same type of operation. And the very reason that we are still here is because we've been able to go through that change and continue to operate our business under a different format or as a different type of entity than the old breed. I think if we had maintained our status as the quote-unquote old breed, we would very possibly not be here any longer.
And after 140 seasons, what does Rocky Point have to say about the idea that the amusement park is dead?
If anybody said to me the amusement park is dead, I would have to just ask them to look around themselves and ask them if they could tell me that that's not life.
However, Rocky Point seems to be the exception and not the rule. And as small amusement parks all over the country begin to fail, the theme park, only 30 years old, is going strong. But in doing so, is the idea of an individual place lost?
We have. That's why I said we've lost that sort of family fellowship get-together that was down there. As I said before, you could, people down there, hi, I haven't seen you in, you know, a couple of months. How you doing? What now? How's your father? How are your kids? You know, that kind of thing. When you couldn't walk them down a fairway and go straight through without, you know, you got to stop. Suppose you had to go meet someone over to the roller coaster and you was up near the popcorn place or something. By the time you got down there, if you got them some ice cream, it'd be melted because you had to talk to too many different people. You know.
I do think that we lose some of our regional identity by losing something like the amusement park. A sense of community. I mean, you went to an amusement park in your local area, you'd see all your friends there. Go to Disney World, you probably won't see anybody you've ever seen in your life. And there are thousands and thousands of people there. You know, it's just, yeah, it's a little scary. It's sort of like those movies, you know, Westworld and Future World, and you know, I mean, that's scary. Yeah, and I see some of that with theme parks, and I haven't been to that many, but I've been to Disney World and Disneyland and Six Flags over Texas and a few others, and they're squeaky clean, and it's scary.
All the old people, you know, that was there, like Grandma Twine, who was one of the head Republican ladies. She says, no, can't replace Crescent Park.
I'd like to see a small park put back here, probably with a nice restaurant, maybe an arcade for the kids. Just something small that could be easily maintained and keep the name Crescent Park.
Today, we live in a very global society. We all have the same experiences and often do much the same thing. We also go to the same places as everyone else. We used to go to a local movie house to see a film. Now, we go to a multi-cinema, which looks very much like any other multi-theater complex. We used to go to a local market to pick up a gallon of milk. Today, the corner market is a chain store, just one of hundreds that stretch across the country. And we used to go to amusement parks. In its heyday, a resident in East Providence could choose from any one of 4 resorts to visit. Today, everyone in the country shares just a handful of amusement parks. What does that say about us? What is to be said about a country with so many more individuals and so fewer individual things to do?